quite a treat. I think this is the first for the Foley Institute. We have a comedian who will be speaking. We have Yoram Bauman, who makes his living as the world's first and only stand-up economist, is what he titles himself. But he also has a doctorate in environmental economics, and he is a fellow at the Cynicism Institute, which is a Seattle-based nonprofit research center focused on sustainability in the Northwest. Yoram is also a serious academic. He is the co-author of two-volume Introduction to Economics and to a 1998 book entitled Tax Shift, which helped inspire the successful revenue-neutral carbon tax in British Columbia. Yoram lives in Seattle, and he has a BA in mathematics from Reed College, and he has a PhD in economics from the University of Washington. Join me now in welcoming Yoram.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I hope you won't hold the Husky connection against me. So thank you all. I'll confess up front that I'm not going to be super funny today at lunch because I'm going to be funny later on. So I'm doing a comedy talk at 6 o'clock in Todd Auditorium, and everyone is welcome. At lunch, I don't know, the only joke I've been able to come up with so far is that I know this hasn't been part of the econ department because there's a free lunch. Ta-da-boom. Thank you very much. I'll be here all night. So the way that I'd like to run this is I've just got a couple of slides. I'll run through them, and folks should ask questions as we go through. So no need to hold your questions till the end. I will start with this. So this is maybe I'll tell a little joke here. I lived in Beijing. I figured if I was going to work on climate change issues, which is what I do when I'm not telling jokes to people, that I should know something about China. And so I finagled a visiting position at a university in Beijing and lived there for the second half of 2011. This is a view from my apartment building, my apartment window in Beijing. I lived in a housing complex that houses 400,000 people. And I was one of two non-Chinese people who lived there. It was me and the guy that everybody there referred to as the black guy. And then one day I was walking down the street to the bus stop, and I saw a black guy, and I kind of lost my sense of propriety. Like, I stared at him, and I kind of walked up to him, and I pointed at him, and I said, you must be the, but before I could get the words out, he pointed at me. And he said, you must be the white guy. Sure enough, I was the white guy. He was the black guy. He was from Ghana. He was there on a scholarship. Super nice guy. We went to McDonald's. We had lunch. International sign of friendship. So this is a view from my apartment window. About 5% of the time it looked like this. Much more often the view from my apartment window looked like that. Yeah, so pretty serious pollution problems in China. I mentioned sort of the story about the white guy and the black guy partly because it relates to something that I'm modestly proud of. This is what I call my 5 Chinas theory of the world. And the 5 Chinas theory of the world says that you can take the world population, which is how many people? 7 billion people. You divide by 5, you get 1.4 billion, which is approximately the population of China, right? So you can divide the world up into 5 chunks that are the size of China. So here they are. China, India has about as many people as China. Add up everybody else in Asia. So Indonesia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, the Philippines, Vietnam, add all those people up, about the same population as China. Right? So there's a lot of people in Asia. Right, the OECD is essentially the rich world. So North America, Europe, Japan, South Korea, a couple other random countries. Right, add up all those people, about the same population as China. And then the 5th China is everybody else, principally Africa and South America. Right, so over the decades ahead, over the lifetimes of a bunch of folks in this room, we're going to be adding 2 or 3 more Chinas to the planet. Right, going from 7 billion to like 10 or 11 billion is the current estimates. But what's really driving climate change issues and carbon emissions is not so much population growth as much as it is economic growth. Okay, and there's a lot to be positive about. I think there are kind of going to be 2 big stories of this century. One of those stories is going to be about economic growth and development in poor countries. We've seen that in China over the last 3 decades, kind of growing at 10% a year for 30 years. There are certainly some negative aspects to that, but there's also a lot of positive aspects to it. People coming out of poverty, getting access to electricity, transportation, healthcare, education, things that we take for granted. Right, and hopefully we're going to see waves of development in the years ahead, in the decades ahead in India, in Africa, in places that are currently very poor. I think the other big story this century is going to be dealing with the environmental impacts of having 7 billion people growing to 10 or 11 billion people who are all trying to live the way that we live. And just to give you a sense of what that looks like, so here's the world population with these 5 Chinas. If you look at per capita carbon emissions in those 5 Chinas, then you get that. Right, so at the beginning of this century, the rich world was responsible for about half of world CO2 emissions. That's changing rapidly, and that kind of provides some context for the discussion today. Again, if you have questions or comments or anything, feel free to holler as we go through. Otherwise, we'll go to this. So this is my 2-second version of climate science. I'm not a climate scientist. I do a lot of talks for fairly conservative audiences like the Barry Goldwater Institute and the Florida Bankers Association and trucking executives on the banks of the Arkansas River. And so when that was a story. So when I do a little, basically what I do with them is I've learned that if you make people laugh for 45 minutes, then you can kind of talk to them about whatever you want for 5 or 10 minutes, and they will forgive you. And so I will share with you sort of what I do with them, which is kind of talk seriously about climate change for a couple of minutes, except you all don't get the jokes, right? If you come tonight, you'll get the jokes, but you're here just for the pain. So we're going to start with this fact that carbon concentrations in the atmosphere are going up. Nobody really doubts this. Nobody doubts that this is driven primarily by human activity, like burning fossil fuels and deforestation. All right, then we have this theory that says that if carbon concentrations go up, then global temperatures are going to go up. This theory actually predates Al Gore. That joke did better with the trucking executives on the banks of the Arkansas River. It goes all the way back to this fellow, Arrhenius, who was a chemist in Sweden. And in 1896, he made the first estimate of how much global temperatures would increase if we doubled CO2 in the atmosphere, which we're on track to do kind of the middle of this century. And his estimate from 1896, about 5 degrees Celsius, 9 degrees Fahrenheit, is still pretty close to the range that climate scientists talk about today. Right, the big difference between where he was then and where we are now is that he thought that climate change was going to be awesome because he lived in Sweden. And we tend to be a little more concerned about like changing the basic functioning of planet Earth. In any case, we've been running this experiment on planet Earth for the last 150 years or so, and here are the results of the experiment going back to the 1880s. The blue dots are individual years. The red bars are 10-year average temperatures going up through the 1970s, the 1980s, there's the 1990s, there's the 2000s. For what it's worth, there's the first few years of this decade. Temperatures going up pretty much in line with the projections of climate science. You may have seen stuff in the news lately that there has been, quote unquote, no global warming for the last 10 or 15 years, which is broadly true, like you can see that from the data, but you have to put that in the context of temperature changes over the last century, right? In any case, if you happen to not believe that humans are partly responsible for increasing global temperatures, I will try to find common ground with you anyway. And the common ground comes from the way that economists think about pollution problems, which is that the way to get less pollution is to make polluting expensive. Because when you make polluting expensive, you get market forces working to promote conservation and innovation and the development of new technologies and all the things that I, at least, love about capitalism. That's what I work on as an environmental economist, is sort of using the tools of economics and the power of capitalism to protect the environment. A couple of policy tools to talk about, like a carbon tax or an auction cap and trade system, but the point of those policy tools is to drive up the price of fossil fuels. This is generally the part in my talks where people stop laughing, because it's hard to convince people that we should be paying more for gasoline and electricity and things like this. But there is a side benefit to these policies, other than, like the main benefit of potentially saving the world. Right. And the side benefit is that if you do these policies right, you generate a pile of revenue. Government can do all sorts of stuff with that revenue. I'm sure you have your own ideas about what the government can do with a pile of revenue. But the idea that I work on and talk about is that we could be using most or all of that money to reduce or eliminate existing taxes. So it's called environmental tax reform or tax shifting or revenue neutral tax swaps. Right. The idea being that we should have higher taxes on things we want less of, like pollution. And then we can afford to have lower taxes on things we want more of, like jobs and income and savings and investment. Right. And there's even this is where I find common ground kind of, even with folks like George Will. So George Will is a columnist for the Washington Post, pretty conservative fellow. He came to one of my classes a few years ago. He doesn't believe that humans are partly responsible for increasing global temperatures, but I asked him if he would support replacing part of the payroll tax, part of the employment tax in this country, with a carbon tax, and he said that he was all for it, right, because he hates the payroll tax. He actually said he would be in favor of replacing the payroll tax with a yogurt tax, but there would be tremendous deadweight losses from a yogurt tax of that magnitude. So, God, I love a room that gets a good deadweight loss joke. You guys are great. So anyway, I said, all right, a carbon tax. So Al Gore thinks that's a good idea, and George Will thinks it's a good idea, and I think it's a good idea with unemployment at 8%. I don't like the payroll tax, and Al Gore doesn't like the payroll tax. Al Gore says we should tax what we burn and not what we earn. So I asked George Will what he thought about the fact that he and Al Gore agreed on this particular issue, and George Will said, well, he said, an idea should not be held responsible for the people who believe in it. So certainly kind of economists kind of across the political spectrum, from pretty left-wing economists like Paul Krugman to both of Mitt Romney's chief economic advisors, Greg Mankiw and Glenn Hubbard, both think this is a good idea. People like Art Laffer, if you're familiar with the Laffer Curve, think that revenue-neutral carbon taxes is a pretty good idea. And there's even a place that's done this. Right? So to our north, the Canadian province of British Columbia has what many economists consider to be the best climate policy in the world. It's a 100% revenue-neutral carbon tax. And the policy was actually implemented by a right-of-center political party. It sort of said, look, we want to do something about climate change. We don't want to grow government. We want it to be market-friendly. And so they ended up with this carbon tax. Carbon tax is not nothing. All right, so I'm not here to try to sell you a free lunch. I'm here to try to sell you value for money. So what they did in British Columbia, the carbon tax in BC is $30 per ton of CO2. So to put that in terms that might make more sense, it's an extra 30 cents a gallon of gasoline. Okay, it's an extra 3 cents a kilowatt hour of coal-fired power, 1.5 cents a kilowatt hour of natural gas power, 15 cents a therm. Right, so fossil fuel prices are going to go up. Right, what did they do with all that money? Over 6 or 7 years, they generated $5 billion. Canadian dollars, but they're about at parity with the U.S. dollar, so I can't make any jokes about that. All that money, in fact, a little bit more than all the money, is used to reduce personal and corporate income taxes in the province of British Columbia. Right, so BC now has the lowest personal income taxes in all of Canada. They have the lowest corporate income taxes in the G8 group of rich democracies. There's an offset for low-income households that works through the tax system. Really, in my view at least, a terrifically smart policy. Like if you asked a bunch of economists to design a climate policy, I think they would give you something pretty close to the BC carbon tax, which is pretty neat. It's not all that often in the real world that we see policies that actually match up pretty well with sort of how economists would suggest we do things. Interesting politics about this that I would be happy to talk about during Q&A if folks are interested in kind of how it passed or what the reaction was up there, because I'm sorry? Because it is pretty interesting. But let me move at the moment and move to talking about how it's worked in British Columbia. So the carbon tax in BC started in 2008 at $10 per ton, and it went up every year by $5 per ton per year until it peaked last year at $30. Okay. So here's how it's worked. First of all, let's look at economic growth in British Columbia. So here's BC is in green, all of Canada is in blue, and you can see that the carbon tax hasn't hurt British Columbia, right? It's outperforming Canada as a whole, so there's no evidence that the carbon tax has hurt. And in fact, there are studies now that suggest that the carbon tax is actually helping the economy of British Columbia, mostly because the idea is that the corporate and personal income taxes that they're reducing are a greater drag on the economy than the carbon tax that they're backfilling the revenue with. Right? That the carbon tax is sort of a better way to generate revenue than the tax system they had before. We can also look at fossil fuel consumption in British Columbia. So here's motor gasoline sales. Again, BC is in green, all of Canada is in blue. The big drop at the beginning is because of the financial crisis. My title for this slide is Economics Works. Right? Like when you put a price on something, people buy less of it.
Is that per capita or scaled to 100%?
Yeah, so this is relative to 2007 consumption. This is not per capita. If you look at per capita, the drop is actually even bigger because BC's population has been growing relative to the rest of Canada. An interesting paper came out recently, I guess it's just out in a working paper form, that actually looked at the drop in motor gasoline consumption was about 18 times greater than what you'd expect from short-run elasticity estimates. And so it was a paper that kind of looked at what's going on with that. And kind of one of the theories was that maybe there's just been sort of so much media attention that people respond to that in a way that is a lot stronger than the way they respond to the fact that gas prices tend to vary considerably over the course of a year. In any case, I think the evidence from BC, where they've reduced emissions by about 10%, the economy's doing great. Both of the political parties up there are now pretty happy with the carbon tax. It's really, I think it's a terrific, positive, very happy story in a world where we don't have all that many happy stories about taxes or about climate change. And the people in BC seem to be pretty happy with the carbon tax. I should qualify that. They're not happy in the like, hey, I went to Disneyland kind of happy. Right? They're happy in the like, hey, I went to the dentist and everything's okay kind of happy. Right? Like they're, in the context of tax policy, they're pretty happy with the BC carbon tax, right? And that shows in the political system up there. So mostly what I'd like to talk about with you is how we could bring a BC-style carbon tax to Washington State. I'm part of a group that is advocating for a proposal to do that. And so I'd like to share with you how a BC-style carbon tax could work in Washington State. We don't have an income tax in Washington State, so the basic premise is let's look for a kind of a broad-based tax that affects lots of people, lots of businesses. We came up with the sales tax, so we're going to reduce the state sales tax by a full percentage point. This may or may not sound like all that much to you, but nickels and dimes add up over the course of the year. This is hundreds of dollars a year for an average household in Washington State in savings. If you want numbers, this is about $1.2 billion a year. So that's real savings for taxpayers in Washington State. And then, so this is the bulk of the policy, and then we sort of designed little parts of it to address particular groups, individuals, business categories that might be relatively strongly affected by a carbon tax. So those groups are low-income households, manufacturing, small business, and agriculture. Okay, so what we did for those groups, for low-income households, we're funding the Working Families Rebate. So if folks have questions about this, I'm happy to wonk out about it with you, but it's effectively an earned income tax credit style policy at the state level. So the earned income tax credit is the largest anti-poverty program in the United States. It's essentially a Milton Friedman style negative income tax. So if you're low income and you're working, instead of paying taxes at the end of the year, you get a check from the government. About half of the states have a state-level version of this that works through their state income tax system. We don't have an income tax in Washington State, so it is. This is actually law, the Working Families Rebate. It was passed by the legislature, signed by Governor Gregoire a few years ago, and it works as a sales tax rebate. But it's effectively this. It works the same way as the income tax rebate. The amount that you get back as your sales tax rebate depends on your federal EITC. The only challenge with this is that it's never been funded in Washington State. So it sits on the books. It's never been funded. So $200 million, you could fund the Working Families Rebate at a really terrific level that would help offset the regressivity of a carbon tax. And plus, I mean, the sales taxes are regressive also. So those things I think would make the policy pretty good for low-income households. What about manufacturers and small businesses? So for manufacturers, you can eliminate the BNO tax for manufacturers. So the BNO tax is the business tax in the state. Manufacturers pay about $200 million a year in BNO taxes. They would pay about $150 million a year in carbon taxes. So overall, we think that's going to be a net win, and we're looking to do some case studies. We've done a couple, looking at actually talking to individual manufacturers and saying, hey, are you going to come out ahead or behind with this kind of policy? And we think that we've gotten pretty good results from that. And then we can triple the small business BNO tax credit. That's something that lots of folks have wanted to do, but they just can't find the money for it. So again, this is $1.2 billion a year for the sales tax. That's the main chunk of it. The Working Families Rebate is $200 million a year. The BNO tax for manufacturers is $200 million a year. The small business BNO tax credit is $100 million a year. Add that all up, you get $1.7 billion a year. What are we doing for agriculture? So we actually looked for something like the BNO tax that we could offset for agriculture, and we couldn't find a good tax to offset for agriculture. So to paraphrase something that I heard from somebody with the Association of Washington Business, farmers don't pay a whole lot of taxes. Right? And as a result, what we decided to do, you can make your own decision about whether that's a good policy or not, but what we decided to do was to exempt farmers, exempt agricultural diesel use from the carbon tax. As an economist, I'm not super happy about that, but I think if you're looking at doing something that that's trying to sort of offset impacts and be kind of fair, quote unquote, then it seems like a reasonable thing to do, and in the grand scheme of things, it's really not that much in terms of fossil fuels. So how do we get all the money for all this? So we're going to make up the revenue with the carbon tax. It's going to be a BC-style carbon tax, applies to fossil fuels burned in the state of Washington, applies to jet fuel, it applies to imported electricity, the carbon content of imported electricity, and that's going to generate about $1.7 billion a year. Sales taxes, so we're having these tax reductions, especially the sales tax reduction that's going to kind of grow with the size of the economy. So sales tax revenue more or less grows with nominal GDP. The carbon tax, we're going to increase it roughly with nominal GDP, maybe plus 1%, because carbon emissions are going to fall, slowly over time. So in order to keep pace with the tax reductions that we're funding, we're going to slowly increase the sales tax rate. Or excuse me, in order to offset in order to balance with the fact that the sales tax reduction that we're funding is increasing, we're going to increase the carbon tax rate. So by it's going to increase at a relatively low rate, kind of with inflation, nominal GDP plus 1% or something like that. And by 2020 or so, we'll have the same $30 per ton of CO2 that they have in British Columbia. Right, so we start at 25, and we go up from there. Hang on one second.
Subsidize farmers instead of exempting them?
Subsidize them how?
Per acre or per kind of output? Or?
I don't know. We're trying to keep the policy simple, I think. There are also, so the state constitution has limits on gifts of public funds except to the poor and infirm. So, for example, one idea that people sometimes talk about, it's, I think, largely pushed by a group called Citizens Climate Lobby. They work on something called tax and dividend, where you take the money from a carbon tax and you give it out to everybody on a per capita basis, so everybody just gets a check, kind of like the Alaska Permanent Fund. And our legal folks tell us that you can't do that in Washington State, basically because of this same constitutional issue, where you're not allowed to provide gifts of public funds except to the poor and infirm. So, but I'm open to other ideas from anybody. Jonathan Yoder, yeah.
I'm not all that familiar with the BNO tax structure. So, are there other categories of BNO taxes that you are not including? And the question is why? I mean, it looks like focused on manufacturers in particular.
Focused on manufacturers in particular because they're the high energy users. I mean, you look at most kind of your average business, like if you look at whatever.
So you chose that.
We chose manufacturers.
To offset the.
That's correct. We looked at a category that we thought would be relatively hard hit by a carbon tax.
On the other hand, why not all of them?
Oh, we ran out of money.
Got it.
So that's one thing I'd say is that I mean it would be nice to provide lots of benefits for lots of different groups. Reducing the B&O tax in general is expensive, right? I mean, it's kind of like reducing the sales tax. Like it's a whack of money to have a significant reduction in the B&O tax. The other thing I'd say is even though we think about sales taxes as being consumer taxes, there's about a third of the sales tax that's actually paid by businesses in the state, and some of it's actually paid by governments. Governments also pay sales tax on things. So that is going to actually offset some impacts on a bunch of businesses. Yes, sir.
I've got some practical political questions to ask you, but maybe do you have more substance here? Or
I want to put up our website, which is carbonwa.org. Go ahead.
I represented the faculty in Olympia for 3 years, and there was a presentation.
You represent, I'm sorry,
our
the faculty. Okay.
For 3 years, a while back. And there was an incredible presentation by former governor, Republican Governor Dan Evans, who made presentations to one of the legislative committees, and he threw up data that showed that all the fiscal crises that had hit the state from the time he was governor until that moment would have been alleviated if his income tax had been passed.
Okay.
The point is his income tax hadn't been passed. And the reason this income tax hadn't been passed is because there's such cynicism on the part of voters and legislators that if you impose a new tax, that you really won't take away the old one. Even if you tell them that, even if you promise that to them, they don't believe it.
Yeah.
So how do you overcome that kind of political cynicism to get an idea like this adopted in a state like this?
That's a great question. I mean, I think it partly comes from, well, I've lived in the state for 15 years, so I don't go back quite as far as Dan Evans does, but the most recent income tax proposal, which went down at the ballot, in 2010? I mean, people, maybe you liked it, maybe you didn't like it, but people talk about it as if it was revenue neutral, but it wasn't. Right? Like the intent of that income tax proposal was to generate funds for extra government expenditures, which, again, you can argue that that's good or bad, but it certainly was not a revenue neutral proposal. So I think part of it actually comes from trying to create a coalition of folks that people will actually listen to, right? Like folks who are worried about taxes being too high, which the income tax proposal didn't have. So we have, we're working on adding folks to our advisory board. We just added a fellow named Todd Meyers, who's a free market environmental expert. And he's kind of very clear. He thinks carbon taxes are a good idea, but he kind of insists that they be revenue neutral. Right? And so we're happy to have him on our advisory board. And it's sort of a matter of trying to figure out, okay, who do people trust? And at some point, maybe what you're saying is people just don't trust anybody. And there's certainly that element of cynicism or whatever about government that makes change hard. And
went over one big-time Republican, I think. If you could sell one really credible Republican on this, then that might start the ball rolling for you.
Yeah, so we'll try. But I feel like there's well, let me do two things. First of all, there was some polling that's been done on this, so I can actually share with you a little bit of polling data. I will tell you in advance this is going to shock everybody, but revenue neutral carbon taxes are not a slam dunk. Okay? However, I think the numbers are probably better than you might expect. So here's what we did. Here's what this polling did. We read a ballot title that said, look, we're going to have this carbon tax. We're going to cut the sales tax by a percentage point. You're going to pay more for fossil fuels and stuff like this. And then we read a statement of support that said, hey, climate change is important and we're cutting the sales tax. And then we read a paragraph of opposition arguments, what we'd imagine them to be, which is, fossil fuel prices are going up, you can't trust the government, that sort of stuff. And here's what we ended up with. After all of that, total yes, 50%, total no, 44%, 6% undecided. So I'm not going to tell you that those numbers are great, but I feel like there's a chance. Right? So I feel like we need to work on it. And I guess the last thing that I would say is, so folks who are concerned about climate change, this is not a happy time for folks who are concerned about climate change, right? Because the average voter doesn't care all that much about climate change, right? That's one of the underlying issues, is that climate change is not high on the list of priorities for lots of folks in this country. And so anything that you do is going to have a substantial risk of failure, I think. We saw that with Waxman Markey at the federal level. Anything that you do, I think, is going to be an uphill battle. I think this one is worth trying, if for no other reason than, first of all, it's always good to try stuff. And secondly, I think it'll help us build coalitions over the long run. And I feel like there's kind of two paths. If you're thinking about, okay, how are we actually going to accomplish something on the climate front? I think there's sort of two paths forward. The first path, which I think is the predominant view of many environmental groups in Seattle, is what I call the progressive takeover of the world. Right? Which is, look, we just need to elect more Democrats, and then eventually the Democrats will take over, right? And then they'll be able to do stuff. And the challenge with the progressive takeover of the world hypothesis is that the progressives never take over the world. And that's why we have things, you may have heard Governor Inslee went down to California and signed this supposedly big deal agreement with a bunch of other governors and the premier of British Columbia that said, hey, we're going to do climate pricing, we're going to do carbon pricing, we're going to have a low carbon fuel standard, we're going to do all this stuff it was called the Climate Action Plan. Right? Well, it was a plan, but the last thing in the action plan was something that said that it's not legally binding. And there's really no, I mean, you talk to people in Olympia and they're like, okay, how are you going to get this through the legislature? Right? And I think even if the Democrats took over the Senate, which they're not in charge of, I mean, everybody tells me it would be hard, even if the Democrats took over the state Senate, right? So I feel like that's one path, is this progressive takeover of the world path. And that's hard, right? I think the other path is what we're kind of trying to work with folks on, which is let's actually try to build a bipartisan consensus to do something about climate change that does something about tax reform at the same time. And I'm not going to tell you that that's easy, but that's the path that I want to work on, and that's the path that we're trying. Yes, sir.
I like the $25 a ton to get started, and I'm looking for some way to beef it up so we could actually help cut emissions. And I'm wondering, if you've run out of money to spend the revenues earned at $25 a ton, could you try what Paul Krugman recommended in a New York Times editorial? Or wait a minute, it was the other major columnist.
Thomas Friedman?
Friedman,
Yeah.
and it was, our two big problems in the country are too much debt and too much carbon. So let's have a carbon tax and then use the revenues to pay down the debt. Could the state of Washington bump that tax up and pay down its debt?
I mean, so the state doesn't have the debt that the feds have. I mean, I think we have debt for infrastructure and things like this.
So so for our big capital projects, we
Yeah.
have debt that we've incurred with some sort of a plan to pay it back.
Yeah.
Can we pay that back at a faster rate with carbon tax revenues?
I suppose I don't know whether legally you could do that. I mean, I'm not an expert on how those bonding things work. My impression is that they're like the transportation projects. They have these whatever gas taxes or other things that have gone towards it. You could talk about funding infrastructure, or you could do all sorts of things with carbon tax revenue, right? I mean, basically the carbon tax. The thing that's neat about the carbon tax is the carbon tax is the environmental policy. Like usually people think about, okay, in order to do environmental stuff, we need the government to get a pile of money, and then we need to spend that money on wind farms or whatever, right? Like the point of a carbon tax is the carbon tax is the environmental policy, and then you end up with this pile of money, and it's like, okay, what do you do with this pile of money? So folks have all sorts of ideas. I think federally people talk about using the money to pay down the deficit. I think that's probably not very politically attractive, mostly because everybody likes to talk about paying down the deficit, but nobody likes to actually do it, right? So it's not nearly as attractive as like building stuff. In Washington State, you could, for example, we have $1 billion a year shortfall in transportation maintenance funding in the state, not for building new stuff, for maintenance of existing roads and bridges. You could potentially fill that hole with revenue from a carbon tax. And we actually looked at that. We talked to some folks about it. And to be perfectly honest, we didn't get any traction. So there's all sorts of ideas that you could pursue. I was going to say one other thing. You mentioned something earlier that blows my mind, because you said if we want to, like, we have this carbon tax that's $30 per ton of CO2, or we're at $25, and you were like, if we really want to bump that up. So I actually think that $25 or $30 per ton of CO2, like, that is pretty bumped up, in my view at least. Like, that's a substantial carbon price. And it may not sound like, if you're here from the climate world and you're like, okay, like, we need to cut emissions by 80% in the next however many decades, that may not sound like all that much, 30 cents a gallon of gasoline. But the point of doing climate policy in Washington State is not to solve climate change in Washington State. Right? Washington State is 1/3 of 1% of global emissions. The point of climate policy in Washington State is to set a groundwork for national action, potentially international action. And nationally and internationally, the climate problem is not so much about gasoline, which is kind of the major source of carbon emissions in Washington State. It's electricity, and in particular, it's electricity from coal. And 3 cents a kilowatt hour, which is what you get from coal from a $30 carbon tax, that's actually that's a lot. That is a behavior-changing carbon tax. If you could get a national carbon tax of $30 per ton of CO2, that would be huge. That would be huge.
It is huge, and the only difference is our governors, Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, have tapped into that reduction already by prohibiting the importing of coal-based electricity into our state. So we've got that problem solved by regulation.
I don't think that's true. I think we...
Yeah, it's it's a regulation on the new builds and
Well, the new builds.
electricity from outside,
There's plenty of imported electricity that's coal-based. I mean,
and that's subject to performance standards imposed by Washington, Oregon, and
Okay.
California.
okay. I know this gentleman had a question. Yes.
So I was just wondering, I guess from a first look, it looks like it kind of just is, for the average consumer, it's just going to basically offset. If you drop by 1 percentage point and gas prices go up, it'll just offset. But what about for other costs like shipping and transportation, and more importantly, trade? Because Washington, we have a lot of barges and stuff that come into Washington that probably, I'm guessing, fuel up.
Mhm.
So that would probably significantly add to their fuel costs. So what would that do to the cost of trade and shipping?
I think for most businesses and for most products, transportation costs are relatively small. Right? If you've ever looked inside an 18-wheeler, you can put a ton of stuff in an 18-wheeler. Right? So I was involved in a consulting project once. I think this was a crazy project. I don't think it ever happened. But it was a project that looked at whether you could feasibly set up a nationwide paint recycling program. Right, the idea being that you paint your walls or whatever, and you have a half a thing of paint left, and so you take the paint back to Home Depot, and you leave it there, and then they truck it to some facility and dump it all together until you get this kind of brown muck, right? And then apparently some people like to paint things with brown muck. So we tried to figure out the cost of this program, and I was the first thought I had was kind of along the lines of what you said, which is transportation costs are going to be huge, right? Transportation costs are tiny. The big costs in that program are the organizational costs of getting Home Depot to set aside a little cage and all that sort of stuff, right? But actually trucking things around, you can fit so much stuff in an 18-wheeler, and they get, it's not like they get hybrid gas mileage, but, they get whatever, 10, 20 miles a gallon, right? And you can just put so much stuff in trucks that those costs are relatively low. To pick another example, let's say that to a first approximation, the transportation costs the mode of transportation that's going to have the highest impact is going to be airplane travel. Right? If you're flying across the country, a rough rule of thumb is that if you fly across the country or if you fly anywhere, you're roughly using the same amount of jet fuel, of petroleum per person than if you drove that same distance in a single occupant vehicle. Very roughly. Right? So if you drive across if you fly across the country, you're going to use up about 100 gallons of jet fuel per person. So $30 per ton of CO2 or $25 per ton of CO2 times 100 gallons, you're talking about an extra $25 out of a plane ticket that costs, what, $200 to fly across the country?
500 round trip.
500 round trip, okay. Yeah, so, you're talking about 10%, right? So, yes, sir, in the back.
There was a 2010 report that said Washington was number 40 on CO2 emissions per capita. Don't you think that inducing extra $50 million of taxes is kind of not necessary for a state that's not really emitting as much as other states like Texas, Pennsylvania, Colorado, other manufacturing-based economies?
I agree with almost everything that you said except for the part about we're levying extra taxes. So we're not levying extra taxes. We're having higher carbon taxes, but we're lowering other taxes. Right? Now, if you want to make a case that you would rather have sales taxes and business taxes and small business taxes than have a carbon tax, then you're welcome to make that case. But we're not imposing extra net tax burdens on the state of Washington. Now, what you said that is true is, so I give a lot of talks. Believe it or not, I make a living doing stand-up comedy about economics. So I give a lot of talks in various places, and what I do is I sort of have this little package about carbon pricing that I sort of put into the middle of my comedy routine. And when I go to different states, I'll say what a BC-style carbon tax would look like in Texas, in Mississippi, right? And I do that. I look at per capita. So how much would this be per capita? In Washington State, it's $300, $350 per capita. In other states, like you get up to $600 per capita, $650. So there are other states that have a lot more, especially coal-fired power, than we do. Right? So that's part of the political economy of dealing with carbon emissions in different places, and we actually see that in microcosm here in Washington State. So there are places in Washington State. This is not the right audience for me to tell this to, but I will tell it to you anyway because I'm an academic and I can't help it. So there are places in Washington State, like in Seattle, where I live, that are they're all hydropower, right? So a carbon tax is not going to have an impact on electricity prices because it's hydropower. There are places in the state, at least as far as I know, relative to what the gentleman said over here, they get a lot of imported coal, a lot of natural gas. Those places include, like, if you're served by Avista, if you're served by Pacificor, if you're served by Puget Sound Energy, then the carbon tax is actually it's gonna take. If you take a light bulb, right, a 60-watt light bulb, and you leave it on all day long, then every month you're probably paying $4 or $5 for the privilege of leaving that light bulb on. Right? And a carbon tax is going to add another $1 to that. Right? But if you have a 60-watt light bulb and you're leaving it on all day long, like, you should get like a compact fluorescent or an LED, right? Like, your payback is like a year. Yes, sir.
So you showed what happened to the gasoline consumption in BC. Can you say anything else about kind of sectoral adjustments to new technology or change in operations or something that's gone on there as a result?
I don't think I can. So, I mean, I think what's happened in BC is really, it's sort of the economist's vision, right, which is sort of a million small changes. Right? When people get their utility bills now in British Columbia, there's actually a line on the utility bill that says carbon tax. Right? Like, if you heat your home with natural gas or with fuel oil, then there's a line that says this is how much you're paying in the carbon tax, and that changes behavior. Right? And I think it's a matter of, I mean, it's sort of a matter of just telling anecdotal stories. But I just had a friend, she's an economics professor. She lives in Seattle because her husband has a job there, but she actually works down in Tacoma, which is about an hour's worth of commute, right? And she teaches classes there, and then she also teaches night classes, and sometimes she drives down to Tacoma for her night class and then drives back to Seattle. She gets back to Seattle about 10 or 11 o'clock at night, and then she drives back the next morning at like 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning. And I said, look, like, why don't you just get like a hotel room or something in Tacoma, right? Like Airbnb, or do something. And she sort of said, well, blah. I mean, everybody has a story. But if gasoline was a little more expensive, then she'd probably think about it. My wife and I we live in a little townhouse in Seattle, and we bought it not too long ago, and it turns out that it gets kind of hot in the summer. And so we had a contractor come in and say, what could we do to make it less hot in the summer? And he said, well, you kind of have two choices. You can take this skylight and you can sort of make it a skylight that opens, right? And then the hot air just goes out the top, or you can install an air conditioning unit in the window. Right? Well, one of those is going to use a lot more energy than the other, and those are the sorts of choices that people make on a daily basis. Back, yes, sir.
To help reduce carbon emissions. The industry's done some things like power, I'm sure you're familiar with that, and other kinds of informational treatment to help consumers be aware of the impact of their energy use on carbon emissions. How effective are those, in your opinion?
Give me an example.
Well, Power essentially does a monthly informational treatment.
Are these like the smiley faces?
No, they're bills that come in and say how much power you used, how much your neighbors have used.
Yeah.
Potentially, they could add information about the source of that electricity as it switches.
That's a fine question. I think that I have to confess that I'm an economist, and so I tend to not pay attention to those sorts of things maybe as much as I should. So I'm not the right person to answer those questions. Those are more, I guess I would say, they're behavioral economics or psychology kind of approaches, which doesn't mean that they're not any good. It just means that I don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about them. I guess my natural, again, this is sort of the economist in me coming out, but I'd be skeptical that those are actually going to work in the long run.
Yeah, there's also economic studies. California, for example, had a rate shift that gave a very significant decrease if you could power per unit sold if you decreased over a 6-month period, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you looked at those findings, essentially what they said was consumers only switched when they're aware that their actions could result in savings.
Hmm.
So just the tax alone, the evidence isn't very good either, frankly, that behaviors really change. You have to have coupled together some sort of informational treatment so people realize that you explained the light bulb
Yeah.
has a 20% savings.
Right.
It's not very clear on a day-to-day basis if that happens. So behavioral economics also says people care about consumption today a lot more than consumption tomorrow. Right? There's
Yeah.
sort of undervaluation of things in the future versus system.
I guess what I fall back on is the evidence from British Columbia, where we actually have this policy and it's actually working and it's reducing carbon emissions, and that makes me happy. In the back, yes, sir.
Because this tax is meant to change behavior, it will reduce the use of fossil fuels. And because, if you combine that with just a general societal shift away from the use of fossil fuels, is there any concern that after a time this policy as a tax swap would become ineffective because it just won't generate enough revenue to the point where it would become obsolete?
I think if you're looking like 40 or 50 years out, I think that's something to be concerned about. I think over the next couple of decades, we're not going to get rid of fossil fuels anytime soon. So this is going to be a slow process. And I mean, like it or not, in 40 or 50 years, we're going to have some pretty major changes to our tax system anyway. Right? I mean, the first state to implement a gasoline tax, I believe, was Oregon, and it was less than 100 years ago. Right? So 100 years ago, nobody had gas taxes. 100 years ago, nobody had cars, really. Right? 100 years from now, we probably won't have gas taxes, right? Because people will be driving something else. So we're going to have to do something, and Washington State is dealing with this right now. How do we fund transportation? Because people are driving a little bit less, vehicles are getting much better gas mileage, right? So how do we fund transportation? So over the long term, there are going to be issues. Over the short term, I'm confident that we're going to be okay. Yes, sir.
So I think this is an intriguing idea, but I keep raising political questions to see if they can be overcome. What do you do?
If we overcome them all, will you write us a big check or something? Because that's one of the other issues we need to overcome.
So I actually live in Idaho, right? So what do you say to the people that own gas stations on the Pullman side of the state line if the people in Idaho are getting their gas 30 cents a gallon cheaper? Is there any fix for that?
When I go to Idaho, I tell them that they could eliminate their corporate income tax in Idaho if they adopted a carbon tax.
Let me tell you about Idaho. This ain't so you're going to have political objections among people who have businesses.
What's the gas price difference right now between Washington and Idaho?
Right now, but
Maybe $1 or $2.
It varies.
go to Coeur d'Alene, it's only at 30 cents.
I think. I mean, it's a real issue. It's also an issue. We have a sales tax in Washington. Oregon doesn't have a sales tax, right? There are a whole bunch of people who live down right by Oregon. And I'm not saying that economically it's great, but you know what? We have the policy and we're alive.
So how about in Canada? How do they deal with that cross-province question?
So I don't believe anybody really lives all that close to Alberta. I take it back. There are not very many people. The big population centers are not close to Alberta. The big population centers are close to Washington State. And that's actually one of the theories about why gas consumption has dropped so much in BC is supposedly that people are coming down to Bellingham and fueling up. And if you talk to the people in Bellingham, they're actually really mad at the Canadians because they're like, the Canadians, they come down to Costco and they buy everything and then they drive back to Canada. And they want to have separate lanes that are only for Americans. As an economist, I don't understand. I'm like, don't you have elasticities? Can't you build another Costco? Put more lines in the gas station. It seems like you should be able to expand supply to deal with the Canadian influx. But
data on people driving into Washington State to fill up their tanks.
I think there are some folks who are trying to estimate that, and it's relatively small. Is the best evidence that I've seen. So I mean, I think here you're gonna lose some leakage. Right, with people going to Idaho filling up their gas tanks, people going to Oregon to fill up their gas tanks. I think I would be probably more concerned about that just because there are more people in Clark County, right? That's a big population center relative to the folks out here, and they're also, they're right on the border. Let's see, maybe 1, 2. Do we have time for a couple? I think we have less than 5 minutes. So yes, in the back.
Real quick, another political question. You talked about building coalitions.
Yeah.
And I think you made a pretty good case for how you might be able to present this to sort of a more right-wing leaning, more free market-oriented population. But how might you present it to, say, a more left-wing leaning, say, environmental group that might be more skeptical or reluctant to embrace market-oriented solutions?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I have a confession to make. So I spent a lot of time talking to fairly right-wing groups about stuff, and I feel like I, quote-unquote, have a pretty good handle on how to talk to people on the right side of the political spectrum. 2 weeks ago, I went down to Evergreen, and I gave a talk at Evergreen, and I got totally killed. Right? Like, I do not know how to talk to those people. Like, I mean, there was one fellow who raised his hand. He said, I think that carbon taxes are immoral because people should be reducing their gas consumption because gasoline is bad, not because, like, they're responding to taxes. And I said, okay, like, what do you want to do? Just, like, ban fossil fuels? And he was like, yeah! So, I think the pitch is, ultimately the pitch to left-wing groups is that they want to do something about climate change. And this is something we can do about climate change without the progressive takeover of the world, right? Or while they're working on that, we can do this. So that's kind of the hope is really to bring together sort of left-wing folks who care about climate change with right-wing folks who would like to have a different tax system, and that's what we're trying to do. So again, the website is carbonwa.org. Did you have a question, or you just want to wrap up?
Well, I'll ask you one last question.
Okay.
It builds on the politics questions. And it's less to do with how you speak to average Americans about these things. Because almost all the social science data shows that, especially in evaluating public policy when it comes to science, the public takes their cues from elites. And we know this from like the cap and trade issue, for instance, which lots of Republicans were in favor of until the Republicans, conservatives were in favor of it until the Republican Party came out against it, and all of a sudden it became a very polarized issue. Mm-hmm. And so what is the strategy for getting a bipartisan coalition of elites on board? And I mean, there's a reason why a conservative government had to do this in British Columbia, especially you need to get Republicans on board. Are there any lessons to be taken from British Columbia in doing that?
Are there lessons to be taken from British Columbia? Yes, but they're not very positive. So people sometimes ask, like, how did British Columbia get this really great carbon tax? And the answer to how they got this really great carbon tax was that they had this parliamentary system of government where the premier, equivalent of the governor, right, is in charge of the party and in charge of the parliament. And in this particular case, the fellow who was the premier, Gordon Campbell, wanted to have a carbon tax. And his party was not all that thrilled with it. His cabinet was not all that thrilled with it. The general population was not all that thrilled with it. And he said, forget it. I'm the premier. We're going to do this. And they did this. So that's how it happened in British Columbia. The interesting politics is that actually at the next election, so that was in 2008, the next election in 2009, the left-wing party actually campaigned on an Axe the Tax platform. Right? The left-wing party campaigned against the carbon tax because they thought they could actually make political hay from it. They ended up not winning, right? The right-wing party was reelected, not because people loved the carbon tax, but the carbon tax didn't hurt the right-of-center party. So I think how do you put a political coalition together? I think partly it's a matter of trying to find folks on the right side of the political spectrum who care about climate change, and trying to find folks who I guess what I take hope from is if you find folks, my experience has been that if I find folks on the right side of the political spectrum who care about climate change, they immediately go to this. Right? They immediately go to, all right, let's do a revenue neutral tax swap. And that makes sense. So I feel like we have this potential bipartisan solution to this important public policy issue. And it's going to be hard to make it happen, but if it was easy, then it would have already happened, right? One last question, yes.
Could you talk a little bit about qualifying the initiative and that campaign, where it stands, what your plans are?
Yes. Thanks for the question. So I'm part of this group. It's called Carbon Washington, carbonwa.org. Our idea is to put this on the ballot in November of next year, so November 2014. So that means gathering 300,000 signatures between January and June. We're looking for folks who are interested in helping out with that effort. If you're interested, you can talk to me. You can go to the website. But the idea is to get 300,000 signatures between January and June of next year and put it on the ballot. So that's the plan.
Okay. With that, let me remind you all that he is speaking again tonight, and it's free. It's in the Cub Auditorium at 6 o'clock. And now, join me in thanking our speaker for a really
Thanks very much.